Right, fantastic. Thank you, Mario. So welcome to the Children and Young People's Scrutiny Commission meeting. Although this is a virtual meeting, it is still a formal meeting of Hackney Council, and all the usual constitutional requirements of council meetings still apply, and all contributions are made with the consent of the chair. I would like to remind members that this meeting is being recorded. So this meeting is being held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting will continue to apply, and representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. Just a few points to remember in terms of operability. Please keep your mics on mute unless you are speaking, and please keep cameras on because as chair I will need to identify those who wish to speak. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat section to get my attention. Also, please state your name and affiliation before you make a comment. And please can I remind people that the chat function is also recorded and will be public. So please be mindful of what you put in the chat function, and ideally could you just keep it to questions. It just makes it a lot easier for the smooth running of the meeting. So thank you for your patience. I'm now going to start with item 1. So apologies for absence. So I think we have apologies from Graham Hunter, and there was one other, Martin.
Councillor Claire Joseph.
Councillor Claire Joseph. Any other apologies? No? Moving on to declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest?
Yep, I'm a teacher and NEU member.
Thank you.
And I'm a governor of the Garden School in Hackney.
I'm a parent governor at Sutton Trust.
I'm a parent governor at Benthwell Primary School.
I'm a governor at Sutton Trust. Head teacher at Our Ladies.
Hi, Jane Heaven, head teacher at Cardinal.
I think we're okay. It's just members, isn't it, Martin? So I think we're okay. I think that's everybody. Great. Okay, so now moving on to item 4, the COVID service briefings. So this is the first substantive item on the agenda. Please, can I ask you to turn to page 1 of the agenda pack? There are 2 updates for the Commission from the Children and Family Service at page 3 and Hackney Learning Trust at page 7. We have 10 minutes for this item, so can I ask the directors to assume that members of the Commission have all read the enclosed reports and briefly identify new issues from the reports that you feel the Commission should be made aware of. I'd like to hand over to Sarah. Are you there, Sarah? Sorry, I just can't see you on my...
I am. I'm here.
Great.
Hello. Hi. I would say largely there isn't a massive change since the last time that I reported to Scrutiny. Our referral levels continue to be lower than the norm. We saw a little bit of an increase in June when more children started to return to school, but that's kind of flattening off again. Clearly, we'd anticipate that increasing potentially over the summer as more children are attending activities, but particularly in September when more children return to school. So we're preparing for that. Domestic violence referrals remain higher than usual. We are starting to see a bit of kind of bottlenecking in the system for some of those longer term cases where it's proving just quite difficult to put the interventions in place to really help families through the system. And because the courts are still not operating at full capacity, there's a lot of court cases that are still waiting to be heard. So that's both in the youth justice system and in the childcare system. So we are seeing a bit of a build-up in numbers of children on child protection plans and looked after children. In terms of the increase of the looked after children, some of that is in relation to some kind of family breakdown and pressures in families, but some of it is also because those cases that would normally be concluded through court and children moving into permanency arrangements, they're kind of stuck in that court system. I think other things that are probably just worth noting that as the lockdown restrictions are easing up, we are doing more face-to-face visits to children now. So on our higher risk cases, we're going back to the frequency that we would normally have in terms of face-to-face visits. On some of the less high risk cases, we'll be doing a blended approach of face-to-face visits and continuing with virtual contact. So we're just kind of gradually moving towards a little bit more business as usual, though not quite as usual. And the adventure playgrounds and youth hubs will be opening up over the coming weeks for activities over the summer, but at a reduced capacity due to the social distancing requirements. And then probably just a final note, which Annie might say more about, the DFE devices, so the computers and other devices have started to be distributed. So those that are going out through the schools were distributed largely last week. And we've now got a number of devices that we need to get out through our social work teams. So that's all in train at the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, for the report and for the update. Can I now hand over to Annie before we go to the Commission for questions?
Yes, I'm going to start with the youngest children. So our early year settings continue to increase the number of children that they are caring for and educating. It still remains a concern, and I think Donna will say more about this under item 6, probably, about the financial viability of some of our independent settings for them sustaining capacity over the coming months, because they haven't had the income they would normally have had from parents paying for childcare. Schools have continued very much with the home learning. I think a number of secondary schools have also been able to do some assessments for the year groups who wouldn't have sat external exams, so that they're in a position to know where the children are up to. I think we'll probably hear more about that under item 5. I think the primary schools also have been taking in more children. So some of them have taken in children this term outside the designated year groups, the reception year 1 and year 6. And some primary schools have also arranged for sort of meetings for the year groups that haven't been attending to come in and meet teachers. So I think I would say the other thing that's been happening across primary and secondary schools is that increasing numbers of staff have been able to come into the school settings and are gaining confidence about coming back into a wider delivery of education from September. You'll note in the paper something that's there to follow up the question from Scrutiny from last time about exam assessment, something that's been high profile across the country about ensuring that any unconscious bias is counterbalanced. I'm pleased to say we got advice to our schools very early on. And if you have any further questions about that, I know Anton, who pulled together that advice, would be able to respond further to those. I think when we wrote the paper, we were just going out to say that there was 50,000 available for summer play schemes. I'm pleased to say that 17 schools are running activities over the summer, and that's going to cater for over 600 children, and they are focused on the more vulnerable. So I think that's a really good offer for our children. It's a small number compared to the number of children across Hackney, but it's a significant number of our vulnerable children. Also, following on from what Sarah said, we have distributed the laptops via schools. Thank you very much to schools and leaders who've been involved in doing that. I know that we'll come on to this as well in the next item about the disadvantage for some children who don't have laptops. There is a phase 2 laptop scheme which the council will launch in the coming days to try and recycle laptops to get out to children. So while we expect the majority of children to be back in school in September, we really recognise that the shutdown has indicated how important it is to have a device at home. And we know that we may be facing in September term sometimes when children are sent home for some reason. I think the other thing I want to say is that we've really, just as we were writing this report, the guidance did come out from the government. So really only 10 days ago, saying that they're expecting all children back in September and giving guidance to schools about how that was to be managed. So we've been working with schools, getting guidance out, running online sessions to make sure that good practice is shared and that as much shared planning as possible can be done to be ready for September. And I just want to acknowledge the hard work of all school leaders in preparing for that. It has certainly been a challenging time.
Thank you very much for the report and for the update. Now handing over to members for questions. We don't have very long on this item, so ideally I'd like to keep this to just 5 minutes if possible. So do we have any questions? Shabnam.
Hi.
And Peter's after.
So regarding the distribution of digital devices, I wanted to ask about the increase of Wi-Fi hotspots around schools, because I know that's an issue as well for families that can't afford it, to be honest. It's great that digital devices are being handed out, and obviously there are limitations to that, but Wi-Fi hotspots would certainly help increase access for a lot of people. So can I ask what's being, if there's anything being done about that at all?
Can I ask that you take 2 questions? I'm not going to go with 3. And can I ask members of the Commission to stick to 1 question, please? And if that question cannot be too long as well. So now, Councillor Peters, and then I'll have a second round of questions with Councillor Etty and then Councillor Gordon.
Thank you. So this is largely for Annie. While getting children back to school is immensely important in order to minimise the damage done to their attainment, and also to free up their parents from daytime childcare responsibilities to be able to get back to work, that must be done clearly in a manner that is safe for the children, for the families, for their staff, and indeed to prevent us from contributing to the spread of the coronavirus. So the NEU developed 5 tests, the last 2 of which seem to be things that we could have some influence over locally. That's about a whole school approach and about the protection of the vulnerable. Are we working on how are we working with schools to try to make sure that those 2 tests are fulfilled to keep people safe in our schools?
Can I hand over to Annie or Sarah?
Yes, I can answer those questions, or I can say where we are with them. In terms of the digital devices, I completely agree about hotspots, and that has been a challenge. I know I think we've worked out, based on asking schools to do approximate surveys, that about 10% of children don't have any device, but then there's another 15% who are sharing too much or don't have access to enough bandwidth or to be able to access. There is a addressing the digital divide council strategy, and part of that is increasing the amount of free Wi-Fi across the borough. I can't say that it's been enacted fully. In fact, it hasn't been enacted fully at the moment, but there is a strategy to do that. And I'm not sure if any of the councillors here are on that members group. I think Councillor Bramble is, but that is certainly a high on the agenda of that group. The second point was about the safety coming back. We are following the government guidelines and with public health input, and we are meeting with the unions weekly, the Hackney unions, to address any concerns that they still have. And I know that head teachers are also meeting with their union reps to address any concerns. And I think it's, as you said, it's that balance of risk. It's not risk-free coming back into school, but the risk is very minimal given the number of cases and the strategies being put in place, and that has to be offset against the risk of children staying at home longer and the issues you raised.
Great. Can we move on to questions from Councillor Etty and then Councillor Gordon, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. It's a quick one to Sarah. With regards to adapting support and services for children, I just wanted a bit more explanation on that. And I wanted to know, is it just us as Hackney Council, or is this in partnership with anyone? Thank you.
And Councillor Gordon, can we take your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I just really wanted to ask both Sarah and Annie in terms of anticipated budgetary pressures on their various areas of responsibility in terms of children's services and the Learning Trust and schools' budgets, and what budgetary pressures they anticipate coming, and how soon we'll have a clearer picture as resulting out of COVID and business as usual financial pressures.
Okay, handing over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so in terms of adapting support and services, we are very much working with partner agencies around looking at how we respond to all of the challenges that we've faced over the last few months, and particularly in terms of the summer provision and youth provision, working with the voluntary sector very closely to look at how we can deliver alongside them and support our voluntary sector partners in that as well. I think a lot of the challenges that we are facing are similar right across London. So there are networks across London as well to look at how we can make sure that we're learning from each other and developing some of those approaches, particularly in terms of sort of best practice around things like working with children online and virtual approaches. In terms of anticipated budgetary pressures, we are keeping a very careful track of the money that we've spent so far to respond to some of the pressures. Some of those are really quite difficult to pin down sometimes. So we might, for instance, be paying more for some of our placements for looked after children. We can't necessarily pin that exactly on COVID-19, but we do know there are pressures in the market which are making some of those placements more expensive. There's additional payments that we've been making, or additional support that we've been offering to families in particular hardship, and to some of our disabled children as well. We're tracking that all the way through and working very closely with our finance colleagues. It is at the moment quite difficult to predict how long some of those expenses will be incurred for, but we are doing our best with our finance colleagues to track some of that expenditure and to project some of the future expenditure as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I've got one more question from Councillor Potter. Councillor Potter?
Hi, thank you, Chair. My question was about the devices, go back to the devices. Obviously, it's understandable that it's taken some time to get the devices to everybody throughout the country, obviously, and not just Hackney, but we are almost at the end of the school term when obviously the devices would have been more useful for the past couple of months, really. So I understand in terms of narrowing the digital divide that she's sort of for devices going forward for that child to have access to them, but are there any specific plans in place to give guidance to those children of how they can perhaps catch up during the summer, and how they could use those devices to kind of better affect to help them with their education? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. And I just wanted to say also just the point about the budget for Hackney Learning Trust. I would say the most significant loss for Hackney Learning Trust is the children's centres fees coming in, because we do offer childcare, which is open to a range of parents, and a number of those parents pay fees, which we haven't had. So there is a loss there, and a loss also of some traded income from offering training and things that just haven't happened. I think for schools, I mean, we've got head teacher colleagues here. I think the cost of COVID has been less significant because it's probably been offset by some other costs that would have been in place had children been in. So I think schools haven't found that too difficult, except those with children's centres who have had the same issue about not having income coming in. But I will stand corrected if my head teacher colleagues want to comment further. I think there is concern as we look ahead to what's expected in terms of additional tutoring and catch-up and how those are to be paid for, although we recognise there is some government money coming our way for those. And the other point was about work available to children over the summer holidays. There will be advice on the Hackney Learning Trust website about what can be done. We've been putting up guidance about that throughout, and indeed schools will be setting children activities as well, I'm sure. And I think, yeah, and Jane Heffernan might want to comment.
I just wanted to come in as well to just clarify as well that the devices that have been given out by the DFE, they have been very delayed in coming out, but their purpose is not just about supporting education, but they're also to help social workers keep in touch with children and young people as well. So I think, you know, we're going to find that helpful.
Jane, did you want to come in?
Can I also ask a question?
Okay, Michael. Sorry, can we just let Jane ask a question first, and then we'll hand over to you?
It was just responding to Annie on the costs. So in the main, our costs have in some ways been met, but there have been other costs that we've paid out for that were not expected, not in the budget. So if you tried to go through the government NRED system for FSM, it was virtually impossible to get onto that. And those of us who weren't prepared to wait around and went for a different voucher system are unlikely to recoup that. And that's cost us 70,000, apart from our other costs this year. So I think that there are some costs in the system that may not have been predicted and costed for. And in a school that's got very high FSM, where you've got huge gaps, the money that's being granted by the government for September is quite paltry in terms of trying to narrow that gap for us.
Thank you, Jane. And Michael, very briefly, last question.
Yes, very briefly. I just wanted to know whether all children returning to school are being tested for COVID before they return to school, and is there an independent body monitoring the schools that they are in fact keeping to all the government rules?
So I can answer that. So in terms of the current government guidance for September, we have updated the risk assessment format that schools have used for coming back after half term in June, so that it addresses those, and those risk assessments are checked. In terms of all children being tested, that is not what's recommended, but what is advised is that there's very clear guidance to all families that if their child has a cough or a temperature or any other symptoms, they should not be coming into school. That's the same for staff. And if anyone does have symptoms, they should get a test as soon as possible. And schools, the government has said schools will be issued with some home tests to support that system.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move on to item 5, which is COVID-19 impact of school closures on attainment gap. Please can you turn to page 11 of the agenda pack. Firstly, I would like to welcome our external guests to the meeting. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Rebecca Montacute from the Sutton Trust, as well as Jane Heffernan, Chris Brown and Richard Brown, the heads of 3 local secondary schools. The objectives of this item are set out on page 11 of the report pack, which, to summarise, are how school closures have impacted on young people's education and contributed to the widening of the attainment gap, the challenges of extending in-school provision and the nature of support needed ahead of September 2020, and help identify those priorities and strategies that can assist children to catch up on study programmes and counter growing educational inequalities. We're going to start with Dr. Rebecca Montacute, who is going to provide an overview of the work being undertaken at the Sutton Trust on the impact that school closures may have on the attainment gap and social mobility more broadly. We'll then give a platform to our local schools, who will be able to provide further insight for the Commission as to how school closures have impacted on young people and the challenges of extended school opening. We will then invite Hackney Learning Trust to provide a brief overview. So I'd like to invite Dr. Rebecca Montacute to start to highlight key issues from the report, which is at page 13 of the pack. You've got about 10 minutes, if that's okay with you, Dr. Montague.
Yeah, no, that's great. So hello, and thank you so much for inviting me. This is the first time I've ever seen a council meeting, so it's very interesting from that point of view. So what I'm going to do is give you a quick run through of some of the major points from this report. This is part of a series of coronavirus impact briefings we've done, looking at all the areas of social mobility that we cover. So we look at the early years through to schools, university, apprenticeships, and on to access to the workplace. So if you're interested in any of those other areas, if you search coronavirus and Sutton Trust, you should come up on a page that covers all of our work that we've done over this time. And I would say that the findings from our early years report that came out recently very much echoed what we heard earlier about a lot of providers having quite difficult financial situations. And that if it is that some of those providers have to close, then there's also the concern that going forward, a lot of families won't have that kind of really important early years support, which has an impact on the attainment gap, because children from the poorest backgrounds end up behind before they even go to school. So making sure that they have good quality support before then is also really important. But I'm going to be going through our school shutdown report, which was the first report we put out. So this is based on polling that happened during March and April, so very much quite early on during lockdown. But the findings that we had from this have largely been echoed by subsequent reports that have looked in various different ways later on during the lockdown. So what I'm going to tell you is broadly representative of what has happened throughout. So first off, I'm sure all of you are very aware that children have extremely different living situations, and that will impact on their education anyway. Some people have much better environments to be able to do homework in, much more support from their parents, more stable living conditions just anyway, that makes it easier for them to be in a place to learn when they get to school. But obviously when schools are completely closed for the majority of children, that situation is then very different in terms of just how much their home situation is likely to then impact on their learning. One of the really big things that we found is that the kind of qualification level of parents has quite a big impact in how confident they feel to be able to support their children when they're at home. So for instance, we found that less than half of parents who have either A-levels or GCSEs said that they felt confident to support their children, compared to over 60% of those with undergraduate degrees. And the proportion went up again for parents with postgraduate degrees. So the kind of help and support that kids have been getting at home during this time differs quite substantially depending on what the kind of qualification level of their parents are. We also found, and that this echoes a lot of what we've heard already in this meeting, that there's a big digital divide in terms of the access students have to both laptops, computers, the internet. So this is quite tricky to get at from a research point of view, because you've got the problem that a lot of the kind of polling methods are based on online surveys. And obviously, if you've not got the internet, you can't take part in an online survey. So what we've tried to do instead is ask teachers what their thoughts are on the likelihood of their students having access. And lots of schools did kind of surveys with their students before they left to try to figure out what their kind of access was at home. And we found that in the most deprived schools, 15% of the teachers there actually thought that over a third of children in their classes wouldn't have adequate access to tech. So certainly in the most deprived schools, it's been a really big problem. But there's quite a clear kind of gradient across private schools where teachers tend to think that a lot of their students are going to have adequate access to tech, to the most deprived schools where there's a much higher proportion who think that they will not. And it's not only kind of access to tech as well, although that's the thing we've talked about a lot because it's something you can do something about in the short term. But there's very much also a big issue around workspaces. So actually we found that that was a very common problem. And we surveyed in our university access report students who were applying to university through UCAS this year, and found about a quarter of them didn't have kind of a good working space. And again, that proportion was a bit higher for poorer students compared to richer ones. So it's not just about digital access, although that's something that it's easier to do something about in the short term. But a lot of kids just don't have a space at home to be able to work kind of properly in their home environment anyway. We also found that the kind of quality of work that teachers have been getting back when they have been getting work back has varied quite substantially. So, first off, the amount has differed quite a lot. So 50% of teachers in private schools said they were getting 3/4 of work back, compared to 27% in advantaged state schools and only 8% in the least advantaged state schools. So those are the schools with the highest proportion of children eligible for free school meals. But they were also twice as likely, teachers in the most deprived schools, to say that the work they were getting back from students when they were getting it back was of a lower quality than they would normally have. So it's every single part of the equation. These students are having kind of a disadvantage more so than normal, both in, can their parents help them? Can they access learning from their school as well? We found that teachers in poorer schools were less likely to be set up to be able to deliver online lessons at all. They were less able to receive work back from their kids remotely at the very start of the lockdown. And then through to what work they're actually getting back, that even if the kids are able to get work back, that it is of a lower quality for the students in the most deprived schools. So what is this going to do in the long term? Our colleagues at the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a sister charity to ours, have done an estimate on what they think the likely impact of all of this is going to be on the attainment gap. So over the last decade, there's been progress in closing that gap between the very poorest students and their kind of counterparts who are better off. Now, the EEF estimate that the kind of progress that's been made in closing that gap over the last 10 years is likely to be reversed from this period of time that students have been away. So we're really talking about years and years of progress towards helping those students to catch up being potentially lost because of this. So the laptops that have been provided by government are obviously fantastic, and I'm so sorry to hear that it's taken so long for you guys to get them, and that's something we've heard from a lot of people, that there have been problems with delivery. But even then, in terms of disadvantaged students, it's only been those who are in year 10 this year, as well as other groups who have kind of social workers and things who've been able to get them. So there are still a lot of students who do not have access to laptops. And given the risk that lots of schools are going to have to close again, if there are, say, localized shutdowns later on because of resurgences of the virus, there's a very real concern that even at this point, kids will have to go back again. And also kids who say their parents are shielding, if levels go up again, they might have to shield again, and then they might have issues with going in. There's certainly a case that a lot of students would still potentially benefit from getting laptops even at this stage, and a lot of them will still not have them. There's also the question of how to support students when they do get back into the classroom. So one of the things that the Sutton Trust have been doing is working with a set of other charities to establish something called the National Tuition Programme. So it was announced a few weeks ago, and we're still in the process of determining all of the details. So I might not be able to answer all of your questions on it, but if anyone has any questions about how that kind of programme will work, what it will mean in reality for schools, then anything I can answer at this point, I will. And if anyone has any concerns about it and how it's going to be implemented, then also please let me know, because we will try to feed them in.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Really, really helpful report. It's quite distressing. Makes for quite a distressing read, actually, to think. And also just hearing you say about 10 years worth of really hard work to close, well, or to make efforts to close that gap may well have been undermined in these few months of lockdown. What I'm going to do before opening up to questions, I'm going to ask if we can hear from our schools first, and then we can have questions to everybody, if that's okay. So moving on now to Chris Brown. Is Chris here?
I am. Hi.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me. What would it be most useful for you to hear about?
If you could give us an overview of the what it's been like for your school over the past 3 months. Am I missing something, Martin? Is there? Sorry.
Okay. That's okay. So overview of what we've done at school over the last 3 months. I'm the principal of the Bridge Academy. So to give you a little bit of context about Bridge, we're about 2/3 disadvantaged, so pupil premium students. We're not far off 50% free school meals, so we have a high level of disadvantage, obviously. Equally, and this makes us quite an interesting kind of test case, we do have a number of students who come from very wealthy backgrounds, very advantaged backgrounds as well, although it's a very small number, but we definitely have those students too. We took the decision early on that we were going to try, wherever possible, to do online lessons. So we, from the off, we did online lessons for years 10 and year 12, so the teacher actually teaching online. And then at the first possible opportunity, so once we got really clear protocols in place around that, we extended that offer as well to the lower year groups. Of course, one of the things which you come up against immediately in that type of situation is that, as you mentioned, Rebecca, that many students don't have the resources at home. So tech was a big problem. So we actually gave out not far off 200 laptops. Well, I say gave out, I mean lent out, but we'll see how that pans out. And another issue, of course, was around Wi-Fi availability. So we've done a lot of work sourcing dongles and all of that sort of thing, or paying for students to have data on their phones where we know they'll be reliable about it and so on. So we've done everything that we possibly can, really, to try and give our students as much continuity of learning as possible, and in particular, for them to have continuous contact with their teachers. And even where we weren't initially able to offer online lessons, we had at least one teacher phone every student per week. So once a week. For vulnerable students, they'd be phoned every day. And in fact, as we got better at it, we started doing tutor calls as well twice a week, which were hugely appreciated by students. And so, I mean, what that means is that we've been able to stay very well in touch with how our students have been learning at home. I think what I would say is that we started out with really high levels of engagement. It's been hard to maintain them completely right through to the end. I mean, the students did really, really well, but after half term, there was quite a noticeable drop off pretty much however hard we worked. I think what's been most noticeable for us is very much a lot of what Rebecca's talked about. So we've noticed that, you know, even where students have really enjoyed all of the work, the students who have more complex home lives have found it harder to complete the work for a wide variety of reasons. And we've done all sorts of things like extending deadlines and just trying in any way we can to support them with it. But there's sort of no getting around how much more difficult it has been for a very large number of our students than their more advantaged peers. I think things like finding a quiet place to work has been an enormous problem. I also know that we offered online counselling through Place to Be to some of our most vulnerable students. Of course, that's only really successful if they have somewhere private that they can go and talk online to the counsellor, and that was a big issue for quite a lot of our students as well. So this idea of not having a space of your own or a space to work is a really key one. I think the comment about support from parents who's, you know, for whatever reason, whose academic background isn't quite as strong is, I mean, that absolutely chimes with our own experience, and particularly with our less able kids. It's harder to teach online full stop, and so much of what you do in the classroom is about walking around and checking how kids are doing and giving them a little bit of help or motivation or whatever might be appropriate. Of course, you can't really do any of that with online teaching, not effectively anyway. And so for some of our less able students, that's very, very difficult. And then if parents, and as I say, for whatever reason, there's all sorts of very valid reasons out there, if parents can't really support them with their learning, then that becomes really problematic as well. And so I think what we've seen once we've had the kids back in, and it's been so lovely to get them back in, what we have seen is those gaps. You know, I mean, I think we've seen on the ground exactly, Rebecca, what you are talking about when the form tutors have talked to students about what they've been learning, what they feel confident with, and we've tried to do a kind of touch-in assessment with every single student. We'll do a more formal assessment in September when they come back. But, you know, for quite a lot of students, particularly the more able or more advantaged, then they've said, you know, they've covered an awful lot of the work. They felt well supported by their teachers, and they feel quite well on top of the material. Some of our other students, you know, will say that they really do feel a very long way behind, and they're very nervous about what that's going to mean for them for September. And we know that a lot of our year 10s, so next year's year 11s, really do feel that way. They're already quite worried about their exams. And these are students who, you know, there's no doubt that they've absolutely tried their best. They've really tried their hardest to engage, and their teachers have worked incredibly hard with them. But circumstances have made it very, very hard for them to keep up with their more advantaged peers. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that that gives a good and helpful overview of where we are. I'm very happy to take questions at any point.
It does. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you very much, Chris. It was very illuminating. There were, lots of things that you mentioned that I think many of us wouldn't have even considered. For example, offering online counselling, but if you don't have a room to disclose information in confidence in, then these efforts are futile. So thank you very much for highlighting a number of things that I'm sure many of us wouldn't have even considered. So before questions, can I move on to Richard Brown, who's the Executive Head of Urswick School? Richard.
Evening all, and I'll try and follow on from the younger, better looking Mr. Brown. I've been at this game a little bit longer, unfortunately, and I certainly agree with the Sutton Trust comment about 10 years of hard work to overcome disadvantage and close gaps potentially being at risk. But equally, I would be slightly more optimistic in terms of, I know that certainly in our school, the uptake of work from disadvantaged students have been a lot more than 8%. So I would be more optimistic that more of our youngsters have engaged in work in Hackney, perhaps compared to some other areas. I think to not cover the same ground, we can't underestimate here the level of isolation that some students have felt through all of this. And so the importance of human contact has, with phone calls in particular, which gets over some of the online barriers, I think has been really important. And more importantly, hopefully perhaps lays the ground for them to return in September. In common with most schools, we've had year 10 in over a period of days and weeks. And we're at 85% attendance for year 10. Now, again, that goes against the pattern of national surveys, which says that a high number of parents are potentially not going to come back in September. I'd be reasonably optimistic that, assuming we can demonstrate the case, and the case being that we have minimised risk and that there is a relatively low level of infection in the area at the time, I think we will get a large proportion of students back in September. And just one other point, I suppose, we've all really agonised over these predicted grades. And certainly I'm confident in my school that they have been done in a way that is fair, that avoids bias, and which tries to give children the grades they deserved, which was the Prime Minister's sort of statement at the beginning of all this. But my concern certainly is the noise in the system is that the exam boards are going to perpetuate the status quo. In other words, when they actually award the grades, they are still saying that they are going to take into account previous year's results of the school. Now, certainly in terms of Urswick, we know from mock exam results, from data that was shared with the Hackney Learning Trust through the School Improvement Partner, we know that our exam results were going to be at least 10 and probably 15% up across the piece this year. And we also had a year group that was attending at 96%, which is a pretty high level of attendance for year 11. I have put that in a letter to all of the exam boards, along with some of the research from Sutton about the potential risk of under prediction for disadvantaged kids and all the rest of it. One exam board has said that they will consider this when they are standardising our grades. Another exam board basically sent me something back that said they weren't going to take a lot of notice. And it is hugely frustrating, and will be for the youngsters, if any of them end up getting actually lower grades in August than they got in the mock exams in December, due to a global standardization of those GCSE predictions. And there is, I think, a huge risk that that is going to happen. And again, thinking about disadvantaged kids, the remedy is meant to be to do an exam in the autumn in the subject where you're unhappy with your final grade. Well, anyone knows that if kids have not had any bespoke teaching, and bear in mind they'll then be in year 12, they'll then be doing different subjects and sometimes in different institutions, anyone knows that if you do an exam in the autumn having had very little input from a teacher, you're actually not going to do as well. And there doesn't seem to be any other mechanism whereby schools can appeal. So I wanted to let the Commission know about that, because there is a danger both within Hackney and within individual schools that actually some youngsters that deserve better grades aren't going to get them. And so I wanted to bring that to your attention. Generally, I support everything that that Chris has said in terms of the different provision that schools have been making. Clearly, schools vary at the margin, but I think across the piece, it's been really good, certainly from Urswick's point of view, to be open every day during this crisis. We've tended to have about 35 to 40 disadvantaged learners and where their parents are key workers. And actually, I think by staying open, we've demonstrated to staff that a lot of their anxieties can be overcome, and that we've always reduced risk. Fortunately, certainly since Easter, we've not had any confirmed COVID cases amongst staff or children. And I think that does reassure people that we can, provided there isn't some local spike or outbreak, we can open with minimal risk in September. And that's the message, I suppose, that I keep trying to get across to parents and indeed to my colleagues in school. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. And again, some really useful points to highlight to the Commission, in particular about the exams. I think that many of us had some concerns about predicted grades, but I think that you just outlined exactly what the issues are with using predicted grades and then offering exam opportunity for young people to sit exams if they're unhappy with the predicted grades that they receive. Before questions, I'm going to move on to our last contributor from one of our local schools, and that's Jane Heffernan. Jane.
Well, the two gentlemen Browns have answered, given a lot of the information already. I'm very happy just to talk through a few things and highlight them. So I read with interest the research. I did reflect.
Jane, you're on mute.
Thank you for that. So we shut the week before for a day to get the staff trained and make sure that they were able to access things remotely and make sure that they had prepared the teaching and learning resource materials, so with things uploaded. And so our engagement has been very high with our students, and that's because they were also briefed. So before they left, we brought them back in, made sure they all had access, and identified before they left us who did not have access to technology, and then basically used our resources in the school to reallocate those laptops to the children more or less from the start. We also broke our school into different groups. So staff are working either on teaching and learning, attendance or engagement. And so we've had very high attendance ranging between 80 and 90%. And children who didn't attend were then followed up. We took phone calls home, and if they didn't attend, they were brought into school. And that was made very clear from the beginning. And we've also had an engagement team, so not just looking at did they physically log on, but were they providing work that was of an adequate standard, and following through on that. We have run mock exams for all of our students. So our year 12s have been taught from the beginning with lessons, online lessons, attendance, and that's been about 97%. And they've just had their mock results back. And that's given us the information about what to do next and the interventions that needed for them. And the same thing with our other year groups. So we have been working very hard as a school to track. We've also been offering, as Richard has said, and some work to do with predictions, and we are worried about that. And we do hope that our predictions will be accepted. But we are still considering now the options for September and trying to look at how we're going to continue to engage our young people. Just a comment about the resources and tutoring. I think that from those of us who have been around a while do know that if you have tutors who are not actually part of the school, that the impact is very limited indeed, because there's no real buy-in and commitment. because one of the things that makes Hackney School so successful is that people are driven and committed to the young people in our care. And I think when you don't have that coming from within, I think that will reduce the impact. And so although I appreciate the government's intent, I think that providing a lump sum amount of a very small amount to the school in very similar nature to both the other schools that have contributed today in Urswick and Bridge, we've got very high FSM and people premium, and those young people will be disadvantaged anyway because their parents are not third level educated or even second level educated for many of them. And so we've got a lot of work still to be done, and we need those resources on site with our children day to day, because it is about trust and relationships as well, to bring them back in. And I think that's what a lot of us have traded on, that we have got those relationships with young people. So when we do give them a call and say, come on, what are you doing? Why haven't you done whatever you're supposed to have submitted? So I think it's really, for me, those are the things it's about. We've gone as far as we can this year. We invested very heavily both on remote teaching, but also on hard resources so that the children would have those, so that we were trying to complement. They weren't always online, not just because some were disadvantaged, but also just to give them a different diet. But I think it is about September and where we go to next. So a lot of our primary children coming into secondary, looking at how we're going to inculcate in them an induction program. So we've done a lot of online meetings with them and made phone calls and tried to identify a nurture group for them. So we've got some coming in very early on separately to try and do transition arrangements for those young people. So I think there's a lot has already been said. It is complex, and it is important that continuity for our young people, that they still see us here and know that we're here, I think is important. So where we did write to them very frequently at the beginning, and we wrote to the parents and to the children individually, but it was also about keeping our staff motivated and engaged, because many of them were working at home under highly stressful circumstances. And I think it was important to think about that aspect and that staff well-being also. So we did have a daily update, and we did have staff have been back in school. So we've had a couple of whole school inset days, so they've been in, separated out socially, obviously, and including during this week, because I think keeping that staff morale up has been really important too, because the children sense it, and you've got to motivate the staff also to mark that work, to respond to them when they're not seeing the children. And a lot of our lives are about being with young people. That's why you choose to come into teaching. And when they're not with you, school's a sad place. You're empty. And I think it is about trying to keep people positive also. So looking forward to September, but a bit anxious, I think, about what will happen and the phased return. I think there's a spike in September. I think that'll be a real challenge for all of us. And I suppose that's what we're all trying to do. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Again, really interesting to hear from you about the National Tutoring Programme and what your views as a head teacher of one of our schools are on the government's offer. I had a feeling that you might have felt that way. I think simple maths tells you that the money is just not enough to make much of an impact. I just thought before we move on to questions that we actually have another head teacher who's actually a member of the Commission, Justine, and I wondered whether you wanted to come in and say anything at this point.
I think my colleagues have covered the points, really well. I share some of Jane's concerns around the National Tutoring Programme, having been somebody who's run in-school tutoring with outside programmes before. It's so difficult to identify specific gaps in learning because they're so based on the curriculum that's been delivered, and really the best people to do that are the people in the school. So, I would be much keener that funding was going directly into school to the people who actually know the students, have relationships with the students, understand the curriculum that's being taught, and then can identify and work in closing those gaps. That money could very easily be spent on making students and parents feel like intervention has been put in place, but it actually hasn't had the kind of impact that it should or could have. So that's definitely a concern going forward. Lots of things that have been spoken about around engagement and digital devices and space at home. those are really where you see the dips. And it's very difficult until they're back in school to really assess exactly where those gaps are. Some of the children will bounce back very quickly and some of them won't. So it's also not easy just to sit back and say, this is what we've got to deal with. It will be a process over many months of unpicking exactly where the gaps are, who've really got deep-seated gaps and are hiding them, those who've got shallow gaps that will be fixed very quickly. So I just think it's something that it's very easy to sit on the outside and say, you need to do X, but in actual fact, we need to do A to Z with lots of different students at different times.
Thank you very much. It's been really, really illuminating for us to hear from head teachers. So the way that we're going to order this now, we're going to have questions from the Commission, but if we can try and stick to the various different objectives. So if we can begin with questions on the impact of school closures. Can I also just say that Rebecca, if you do have any questions that you would like to ask, please do feel free to raise your hand or indicate in the sidebar. Do members of the Commission or anybody else have any questions for our heads? Right, sorry. Councillor Woodley, did you want to come in?
I wanted to come in, but not quite on the point that you raised, Chair. So I'll just be very brief, just to say, to echo you really, that it was really great to hear from head teachers, and quite a moving image actually of the empty schools, and certainly not the first time I've heard that. And sort of remembering actually some of the difficulties that staff have been through, and of course our big concerns in September about staff capacity, as well as our sort of parents and families' anxieties. In terms of that kind of confidence and there being quite a large return, I agree that some of the anxieties around coronavirus might have been allayed by September. I think there is still anxiety amongst our SEND families about how our sort of children with special educational needs will cope and will adapt on returning. And I've heard very reassuring things in meetings about how things like behaviour policies and so on will be relaxed for certain students around some of the new guidelines that there will be in schools. And it might be useful to actually hear about that here, because it wasn't touched on in your introductions. But that was all I wanted to add, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Woodley. So I have questions from Councillor Chauhan, and then Councillor Gordon. So we'll just take those two for now.
Okay, thank you. My question is really to head teachers and also Rebecca. How can we share practice about what has worked well in lockdown, like certain practices, like I think Chris talked on tutors running twice a week, and could this feed into DFE guidelines for schools so that we can have a consistent approach for every school? Thank you.
Apologies, actually, I sort of jumped the gun a bit, and I was supposed to have allowed the Hackney Learning Trust to come in also for 5 to 10 minutes. So shall I hand over to Annie? Apologies, everybody.
That's fine. Thank you, Chair. And actually, Councillor Chauhan has probably given a good lead-in to. I'm going to bring in Stephen Hall, who's Assistant Director, to talk about how some of the practice has been shared, and other comments about work during this period. Stephen, can I bring you in?
Hello, hi. Yeah, certainly locally we've been having forums to share best practice with head teachers. So we've been having borough-wide online meetings with head teachers, both primary and secondary, sharing best practice, discussing how schools are approaching it. And I think we can't underestimate how much pressure and how much difficulty head teachers have had in tackling the issues recently. And it's remarkable how well they have provided for pupils in the last few months in terms of making sure that learning is ongoing, that home learning is happening, but also in calming the fears and anxieties of staff and parents in the community. And they've been very much put to the forefront of interpreting government policies. Also, in terms of some of the tutoring, we know that the announcements about tutoring are not fully grown. We know that a proportion of the funding has been passed on to tutoring firms. However, I do believe that a large proportion of that money is also going directly to schools to fund tutoring programs within schools from September. Of course, the devil is in the detail, and we'll wait to hear, but that's certainly one of the intents. And in terms of other areas of best practice to be shared, the DfE has released already best practice guidance where it's been sharing schools and what they're doing during this period of crisis, both for home learning and for adapting their provision to allow more pupils to return.
Yeah, and if I can just add to what Stephen said, I think councillors on this scrutiny committee will know that each school has a school improvement partner who stays in touch with the school. During this period, school improvement partners have generally been ringing or being in touch with head teachers weekly, certainly where needed, so that they have picked up on any concerns from head teachers or indeed good practice to share, and head teachers have shared that practice at meetings of primary heads, secondary heads and special school heads, and indeed I think we've had at least 3 governors sessions, if not 4, to share with governors as well. Stephen and I have a weekly meeting with the DfE contact. It's quite brief, and often they want to know more about what we're doing than they don't tell us very much. That tends to come through the national announcements, but it is a way of feeding back anxieties. So for instance, I think early on we were talking quite a lot about the free school meal system that Jane talked about. So I think the DfE has been aiming to keep in touch with local areas. That there's not always as rapid a response as we want, but that does happen. And I didn't know whether Anton wanted to speak for a minute or two about any key other secondary issues.
Just a few things, and I'll try to be brief. We've also had very powerful the use of our subject network meeting, so subject leaders of exchange practice and insight. Ditto at post-16, where heads of sixth form, directors of sixth form have also debated shared approaches to dealing with the cancellation of exams, to dealing with university applications. Hackney has also taken part with other boroughs in a lost learning project looking at missed learning as well as lost learning, and currently coming from the contact with schools through the school improvement partners, there's growing attention to assessing performance gaps and participation gaps. And increasingly now, as we move close to September, there's more and more conversation about how do you start blending the learning, and there are kind of first signs of kind of pedagogical priorities coming through, such as proactive teaching, direct instruction. How do you create a curriculum that addresses gaps but resumes learning? What are the levers for that? How do you manage transitions and the move to feedback and the development of oracy? And the last one other thing, we had an international speaker talking to primary, secondary and special school heads about a recovery curriculum, and we don't see a polar view. We don't see it's either soft or hard. It's about engaging schools and school leaders in that debate regarding how do you resume learning as quickly as you can.
Thank you very much. Did you have anything else, Annie?
No, I think colleagues have talked about, and I suppose what we've talked about is that sharing of practice and the communication flows, and I suppose customised support for schools where needed, because while schools have very much in common, they're each individual institutions, and heads have their own balance of context of their staff, their children, the geography of their school that impacts things. So I think the individual support has also been important.
I think that's actually been one of the key things that we were hoping to get from this particular item, was to get a sense of what the landscape looks like with our local schools, and to see if we can explore how, or I suppose the extent of the supports that HLT has been providing, and to see if there is that continuity, and if there isn't, if there is a role for us to play, which it would seem that we already are playing in terms of sharing that message of best practice, and trying to promote continuity in terms of that good practice and sharing learning where we have any. So I think that's probably the key thing that we're wanting to take from this evening, is about how we as a local authority can better support our schools to ensure that we're, ultimately all after the same objectives, and that's to sort of bridge this emerging gap and to get back to some semblance of normality, and for that transition to be as smooth as possible. Sorry, Councillor Shorhan, are you happy with the answer to your question? Can I move on to other questions, or did you want to?
No, I'm happy, thanks.
Happy, fantastic. Okay, so I think actually Councillor Bramble wanted to comment. If you could be brief, just so that I can move on to questions.
Thank you, Chair. I won't touch on parents. Councillor Woodley spoke about that. Just saying the voice of children and young people is that they are very keen to get back to school and are concerned about their learning, and just wanted to relay that. One of the things that has come up as well as exclusions, and you know that's something that Hackney are working on to improve, and I've been speaking to Annie about the guidance that we're sending to schools around that, alongside guidance that's already been sent to schools. So I just thought it's important to highlight the voice of the children as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bramble. So I have Councillor Gordon, and then I have Joe. Councillor Gordon.
Thanks very much, Chair. I mean, I'd also really like to thank the head teachers and other educational professionals who've come to the Commission tonight for all their hard and really complex work over this period. I imagine you never thought you were going to be 1 minute coordinating meals to vulnerable children, and the next minute trying to manage a really complex IT project. So I think it's been really, really good to hear from everything you've been doing. My question really is, I mean, it's obviously we've heard some really shocking research from the Sutton Trust about the potential impact of this crisis on the attainment, particularly on the attainment of our, more disadvantaged children. Hackney is one of the poorest boroughs in the country, in the eye of the storm of this crisis. Our children have achieved extremely good academic results. There's been improvement year on year. So my question, I think, really is in two parts. What is the plan in relation to the 2 results days, if all the fantastic work that's been done to try and mitigate the potential impact of bias in the system and possibly unfair results coming to children? What if that goes wrong and our results are, there is a big dip and maybe a disproportionate dip in terms of some groups of children on results day? What is the plan to support those children, and what reassurances can you offer to our children and their parents at this stage that that we as schools and the Education Authority are absolutely on their side and trying to mitigate any impact?
Who would you like an answer from, Councillor Gordon? Who is that directed to? Is it
Well, I mean, possibly the Learning Trust, and maybe if any of the heads want to come in. So, okay. Yeah.
Can I? I'll start off.
Can I just start on that?
I'll start off, Anton, and then you can come in. We have talked to schools and shared practice about what's happening on results day. I think every secondary school is bringing children in, but in a staged way, either with appointments or shifts, if you like, so that there isn't the 100 children waiting for results and hugging each other. That clearly can't happen. So there are timed sessions, and I think I'm kind of optimistic that the children will get the results they deserve, but we know that on any results day there's some disappointment and there have to be some adjustments. Year 13s often have 3 or 4 options ahead of them. It's deciding which one of those works for them, hoping that they have got different pathways ahead of them. And I think that's the same for year 11. I mean, it'd be good to hear from the head teachers about what advice they've given. But I think on the year 11 results day, there are always people ready to give advice and support. And of course, we have heard about the option of retaking exams and appealing, but those are particularly difficult this year. Anton, do you want to add briefly, and then we should bring in the head teachers, I think, because they all have plans for those days, the year 11 and year 13 results days.
We were aiming to visit our schools on the 2 results day. The schools, we invited them to share their data with us, so we can assess the impact by comparing the moderated results with their centre assessed grades. Going back to what Richard had said earlier, it seems that the boards are looking at 2019 as in terms of results. If that's the case, then as a borough, we did well on that. But we're not taking this thing lightly. We'll be meeting schools and looking at the variation. Going back to an earlier point you said about addressing bias, we provided guidance, we're training, we're starting to train our improvement advisors and consultants. That's happening this week. And the paper that we prepared isn't just to do with exams, it's all year groups, and it's about cultural responsiveness. So there really is a moment here of kind of sharing practice to do with addressing kind of bias that happens with teacher assessment. So we have a plan.
Would any of the schools like to come in on Councillor Gordon's point?
Could I come in, as I sort of raised the issue earlier? So Richard here. Yes, there are plans, and yes, there are things that we can do to mitigate, but we also have to be mindful that we may need to use our voice if we think that there is unfairness. And I think that's important. Certainly in terms of Urswick, we will base decisions about students returning into the sixth form to do A-level subjects based on our predictions rather than the final results. Now, you still can't do anything ahead of results day because obviously the predictions are not shared with the youngsters at this time. But we will admit students into our sixth form based on our predictions. And if our predictions have been reduced, then we will still go ahead with letting those students do A-levels. But clearly we'll also have to look at closing any gaps that may have developed over the last few months. I think there's less of an issue around year 13 because all of the work around UCAS applications was done pre-lockdown, and also certainly our experience is that already they've got multiple offers and in some cases unconditional offers. So yes, we'll be in, they'll be in, we'll be doing all the clearing stuff and all of the rest of it. And as you were suggesting, we'll have phased groups of year 11s coming in on results day. But my greatest concern, I suppose, is to some way it will be demotivating and it will cause a lot of individual upset if, as I say, there are youngsters who got better results in the mock than the real thing. And certainly our 2019 results are not a good indication of this year's cohort, which is why I raised the issue. It may be very different in different schools, and that's why I think it's a good thing that Anton said that he's going to plan to visit us and see that picture, because some schools may be affected by this more than others. It's difficult to say at this stage.
Thank you very much, Richard. I just wondered on that point that you made about you being prepared to accept the predicted grades that you will give to your children. Will that be the same for young people coming from other schools? How do you think you'll deal with young people applying to your sixth form who say that you feel that they've been robbed of the grades that they deserve? It looks like Chris might want to come in on that. Do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I might just be able to comment on that a little bit. So, I mean, I think, you know, you'll probably hear the same thing from all schools as what Richard's just said about our own internal judgments. If we feel that the students would have got particular sets of grades and we know, you know, that they would do well on A-levels based on the 5 years of us teaching them, then we will, of course, accept them on those courses. I chair the heads group for Hackney, so I can say that with some confidence that that's definitely a general pattern. I think regarding applications from other schools, I mean, again, the general comment that was made was that there will just have to be a lot more communication between schools about students and what schools feel that students' potential actually is to go on and do really well at A-levels, whereas previously a lot of that was done just via what you hear. Clearly there's going to need to be another layer of communication as well, and I know that lots of schools have already got set up to make that happen. And then sort of going back to the point about the results days, I mean, again, I think you'll hear the same thing from pretty much all head teachers, that they're having results days with time slots and so on, meaning that if and when there are students who don't quite get the results they're expecting, there will be support immediately on hand and guidance about what their best next steps are, and that's equally true at year 11 or year 13. So those students will be supported to go on and make the best choices they possibly can with the grades that they get.
Thank you very much, Chris. Apologies, Jane. I think we may need to move on because we've got quite a few people who've indicated that they want to ask questions, and I'll probably turn to you for the next answer from ahead, if that's okay. We have questions from Joe, and then we have Councillor Patrick. Can I have Joe's question?
Thank you. My question is for the Learning Trust, I suppose. It's been fabulous to hear from the head teachers here tonight about their provision and expertise that has gone into the provision during lockdown. I suppose my question is, to what extent, through the shared practice and the forums that have been taking place, do we have a sense of what the percentages in Hackney of engagement, both in terms of the quality and quantity of that engagement? I think the sense is clearly that in Hackney it's significantly better than the Sutton Trust's research on a national level has indicated. But anecdotally, I think it hasn't been the same in all schools across the whole of Hackney. So I suppose my questions would be, what can be done, what support can be offered to those schools who have probably found it more challenging for whatever reason to provide as much contact, as much support, and to encourage as much engagement, and who therefore may experience bigger challenges in terms of catching up and gaps in the autumn and going forwards?
Thank you, Joe. I'm not sure, Annie, would you like to?
Yes, I think I'll comment briefly and then bring Stephen in. We've very much kept in touch with schools. I referred to the weekly phone calls, so that the secondary team and primary team have absolutely been able to sort of triangulate what's going on. And you're right to say schools have had different situations. So I know early on we had 2 or 3 primary schools who just couldn't open because they didn't have enough staff. This was for the vulnerable children and key workers, because 2 staff were shielding and 2 were ill. And I think that probably particularly affected smaller schools. We are aware of the situation in different schools, and I suppose have provided individual advice for them. So I think that's been key. And then I think the general guidance we've given out, which often where we've both interpreted the government advice and added a local steer as well, I think has probably been helpful. I think there has been some variation, and we'd rather that it would have been, at the level of the top level engagement across the piece. But I think you're right to indicate that where we have had some concerns or feedback that it's not been as strong, that the next stage needs to be really strong in those schools. Stephen, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think our school improvement partners who are linked with each school have been in communication, regular communication with schools about what the provision is and how they're getting on. And that reporting mechanism gives us a general picture of how schools are doing, and also identifies schools that need that bit of additional support or guidance to improve what they're doing or to maximise what they're doing. I think we're sympathetic to the fact that schools are in very different places in terms of what they can do here. So we're not going to get a complete similarity in terms of the resources that schools have to do this, staffing profile, the technological expertise, and so forth. But what we have established is that all the schools have had a real focus on vulnerable pupils, and it's been an explicit expectation that contact with vulnerable pupils would be frequent and regular, and there's been very close liaison with children's social care and the education team and schools to allow for that communication to happen. So there's been some very consistent messaging there with schools in terms of maintain that contact with pupils, but particularly those most vulnerable pupils and those pupils who are not accessing education. And I think we can safely say there's a fair amount of expertise amongst Hackney head teachers and leaders in terms of catering for disadvantaged pupils and vulnerable pupils, although this is uncharted territory for everyone in many ways. And certainly in terms of closing the gaps when pupils come back and identifying where those gaps are, I think we have a teaching cadre and a leadership cadre that are well versed in identifying where gaps in learning are and catering for those gaps. That's not me saying that is not underestimating the scale of the challenge here. I think we can all agree that there will be pupils who will have suffered, no doubt, over the 6 months of not being at school or limited access to online learning.
Thank you very much.
I would just ask a follow-up question. Do we have any sense yet of what the catch-up programme, the filling in the gaps, whether it be on a sort of pastoral level in terms of confidence, well-being, or in terms of actual academic progress? Do we have a sense of what that is likely to look like in schools? For example, are we talking about children having to attend longer hours in school, spend, coming in on Saturdays or during holidays? Is that how is it actually going to look on the ground?
I think longer hours is unlikely. I think additional interventions is more likely. I think one common aim we've had is not to make assumptions about which pupils will come back with learning gaps and which ones will have suffered the most. But to evaluate that once pupils are back in, just to avoid that unconscious bias and also just those assumptions, lowering those expectations of what pupils can do. A lot of this comes down to teaching technique, so it comes down to asking the right questions and doing the right kinds of teaching to be very explicit and make those links between prior learning and current learning to establish what's been remembered. Pulling out those key skills that have been missed during the summer term from the curriculum and mapping those out through the autumn term, not trying to reteach the spring term curriculum, but just picking out the key elements for the autumn term curriculum. And those things are all things that schools are doing now. They're pulling out those skills that have been missed, mapping them out over a period of time, preparing staff for that formative assessment of evaluating what pupils know and don't know, and then feeding that back into the teaching. There's a lot of expertise there, I think, that we can rely on. I'm not trying to paint a really rosy picture, but I am confident in Hackney School's ability to cope with this situation.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Right, so can I just ask contributors, members and contributors, to keep your questions and answers brief, please, because it seems that we have lots of people who are indicating that they'd like to ask questions, and there are still a couple of other areas that we would like to focus the questions on. So next I have a question from Councillor Patrick, and then following on from that we'll have a question from Councillor Etty and Louisa before we move on to the next focus for the questions. Councillor Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. Stephen's answered some of it. I was wondering about what was going to happen over the summer and whether pupils and parents are going to be encouraged to support and encourage pupils. Sorry.
Was that it, Councillor Patrick?
Sorry, sorry, it went. Sorry, the internet went and came. What was going to be done over the summer, and also how secondary schools are going to. Sorry.
Councillor Patrick,
traditionally we've always heard is.
Sorry, you just cut out a bit then.
Sorry. I want to know about how schools were going to work with their new intake, the year 7.
Okay, Councillor Patrick, we're losing you a bit. I'm wondering if it might be useful if you maybe put your question in the sidebar.
I will, Joe. I'll come back to it. Sorry.
Okay. In the meantime, can we move on to Councillor Etty's question?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll be very brief because some of my questions have been touched. I just wanted to ask with regards, because we have spent a lot from parents in terms of parental role and support. And I just wanted to know, what support are we actually giving to some of these parents? Because, I mean, we've been able to identify and hear in terms of some of this attainment gap and, you know, difficulties, but have we come across parents who actually need that support during this period? And secondly, when we are talking about the virtual setting, has there been any situation where in the course of teachers having a virtual discussion or lesson or anything with children, has there been any reason where they've spotted anything and where they've had to signpost the children to other services or anything of such? I mean, because hearing from what Bridge Academy said in terms of counseling, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on that, which I think is a very good practice that they have taken on. Thank you to everyone for all the hard work. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure who would like to answer that question in relation to parents. I don't know whether that's
Councillor Conway. I can start off, and then I don't know if Jane would like to come in with examples from Cardinal Poll. So we knew early on that we were concerned about some families being vulnerable, and that normally schools see the children every day and know if there's an issue, and the children can report it in, and then it can get dealt with either by the first tranche by the school dealing with it, or then passing a referral on to Young Hackney or through FAST to Children's Social Care. So we've set up internally in the council close working team with education and children's social care, and so that any schools that are worried about children can't get hold of them, or worried about what they're saying, would be able to refer on. And I think that's been helpful, so that we've had more education focused staff sitting alongside FAST. So they have dealt with a number of things that then haven't had to go through to children's social care, but have escalated where necessary. So I think that's been important. And there have been issues, you know, I think there have been issues that have come up about lack of money, lack of food. You will have come across these, councillors, I think we'll all have come across them during this period. And I think there has been signposting to key council areas, but Jane will probably be able to bring that to life more as being more hands-on.
I think as all Hackney schools, we have quite a lot of social deprivation, and that brings its own complexity. So it has been really important to maintain try and maintain the same level of contact with our young people. And that's, I think all of our heads have all spoken about the weekly contact and the more frequent contact with our vulnerable children. So we've been contacting them 3 times a week, and we've done that during the holidays, and that will continue throughout the summer. And that does flag lots of issues to do with you know, police involvement, with bereavement, with social services engagement. We have some very stressed families, some very stressed parents, and I think that that hasn't gone away during this time. I think it's been even more important that we maintain that community and that care for our young people. And the free school meal vouchers, for example, has been something that's really important. Food poverty is a big issue, and some of our families are going to go into even more poverty now. And so in the last week, we've had 50 requests to say families are anxious about going into the summer, that they're anxious that they won't have the money they need. And they've called on funds for us. A number of our parents don't have access to public funds. And so that's they would have been perhaps in jobs which did not require them to have a reportable income. And now that's been lost. And so they won't have been furloughed. They'll just be made redundant, but informally, and those jobs have gone. So I think that, I think that there has been a lot of issues for our young people, but that constant contact makes the children understand you're still there, and that although it's not normal, it is our new normal, and that you're working with them. It's been really good to have them in school, so you can check on things, but often you pick up things visually with children, and I think that those visual cues have been missing, and I think that's something that, that's why we need to get them back.
Well, I echo that, because I think the figures that we're seeing from Children and Family Services indicate that has to be the case. The fact that we've had a significant drop in referrals, it has to be because people just aren't seeing the young people. which is obviously hugely concerning. I have Councillor Patrick's question here, which is what work is being done with the new Year 7s, and also are parents and children being encouraged to study during the summer holiday? Can I direct that at you, Annie?
Yes, so there's been a lot of work done with the new Year 7, not with the current Year 6, and I think when back at Easter, I think there was still hope that we would be having face-to-face induction days in July with those Year 6s, but it became apparent certainly in early May that wasn't going to be the case. So work has been done for all Year 6 children, having Zoom calls or Google Hangout calls with the family in the same way that there would have been a meeting face-to-face with the new school. I think also all schools have put things online, so there have been possible talks by head teachers, by heads of year, and we might hear from the head teachers, but I'm not sure if there's time about the kind of things they've done. I think in addition, we were quite concerned centrally about some of the children who primary schools had identified might struggle early on with settling into secondary. So one of our colleagues, Helena Burke, has had that as a real priority to make sure that any children identified by primary schools as vulnerable were absolutely had a conversation with the primary teacher there, secondary teacher, parents and child, so that there's been a more wraparound for those children. And that has also been the case with the SEND children, those with EHCPs, where there's been much more involvement by the SENCOs from primary and secondary in those discussions. So I think given the situation, both centrally looking at the vulnerable children particularly, but also making sure that there's again sharing of good practice about what's happened in all schools for all children, currently in Year 6, moving to Year 7. I think there was also part of the question was about were parents and children being encouraged to study during the summer holiday. We have put work on the Learning Trust website, and schools will have their own approaches to this. We are clear that school staff have largely done a huge amount during the last weeks and will be asked again to do a huge amount from September. So they do need a pause. So there aren't online lessons. There are the activities that 17 schools are running, and some schools will have taken approaches of setting some particular work. I mean, I think probably the Year 10 group and Year 12 group, as is usual, would expect to have some work over the summer.
Thank you,
Chair.
Thank you very much. I just have one more question in relation to children with special educational needs, because I think that many of the questions that we ask about children with special educational needs and disabilities are often focused on our special schools, and obviously the vast majority of children with special educational needs are in our mainstream settings. And I'm just wondering, it might be quite useful for us to hear from the schools about what additional support you're putting in to support these young people, both not just those with diagnosed special educational needs or disabilities, but those who otherwise generally benefit from additional support in school. I don't know who wants to come in on that one.
Well, I'm happy to. I think one of the things we all have to be realistic about is that every child will have special educational needs in September, and there will be huge pressures on the system. What we have done as an individual school is we've doubled the amount of money we're proposing to spend on speech and language. We've put in extra EP provision as well, alongside those in-school interventions that happen quite regularly and all the identification systems that go with that. I suppose my concern would be that every service that currently works with children and young people is actually going to be frontline and engaging directly with kids, because I think there will be a lot of demand in September onwards. And I think if children are coming into school every day, then actually other services must engage with them directly in the way that school teachers and school staff will be doing. I think if we are back, then the days of the online intervention from certain services need to reach that logical endpoint as well. And so I would use my voice now to promote that. But Yes, there will be huge pressures. To go back to something Stephen said earlier, we're not planning longer hours during the taught Monday to Friday, but we are going to do our best to set up a Saturday school. I think students will want that at all levels, and that does actually create a little more in the system, because actually, certainly in my case, I'm coming up against a very crowded, congested building in September, and obviously a lot of us are doing phased openings, so in effect our length of opening is already going to be longer, so any pot of money that comes to Urswick will be used in effect to put in better interventions on a Saturday.
Thank you very much, Richard. I actually have a question for Rebecca, if that's okay. And this actually relates to the national tutoring provision that's been suggested by the government. I'm just wondering what your perspective is on, or what the Sutton Trust's views are on. Obviously, we've heard from our schools what you know they don't necessarily feel that this is going to have much of an impact on the attainment gap. But we just wondered, it would be good to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I'd also say thank you to, was it Jane and Justine, sorry, who raised the issues around it earlier. Those are very much concerns that we have as well. So the government obviously has funded this, but the design of it is being done by a group of charities, including ourselves, the Education Endowment Foundation, and some others. And it is very much being designed with evidence at the heart of it. So it will be in two kind of options for schools. One of them will be something called partners, where you can buy in tuition off of providers who've been approved by the Education Endowment Foundation and are undergoing evaluation as part of it. And they'll be selected on the basis of the existing evidence. So things like, do they have good kind of relationships in the schools they already work in? Are they working well with teachers and making sure that the tuition is integrated into what the school is already doing? The other option for schools, especially schools with a high proportion of disadvantaged students, is that they'll be able to access a coach, and that will be a full-time member of staff in the school. They'll be given training by an external organisation, but they will very much be the tool for the school to use and decide how exactly they're going to target it and with which pupils. So if anyone does have any other thoughts, please do send me an email and I'll post it in the chat thread, because we very much want the thoughts of teachers to make sure this is something useful for you. The national tuition programme will not fix the gap that is going to happen because of coronavirus. Absolutely not. It will be a small part of what's going to need to happen to try to help to make back up the difference in that gap. And we'd be really keen to hear from teachers to know what we can do to make it as efficient out of the use of this government funding for this as possible. On top of that, 350 million is going towards this, but another 650 is going towards general. Schools can choose what they spend it with. So schools will have some funding to be able to spend on their own chosen interventions as well.
Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. It was really, really quite useful. So we've got a few people who have indicated that they'd like to ask questions, but I'm actually quite keen for us to move on to the other objectives. So if you can try and ask your questions in relation to those objectives, I think we have Councillor Shorhan and Louisa who have indicated. If we group these two objectives together, because we're running quickly out of time now for this item. So objective 2 is extending in-school provision. So we're wanting to know, from schools what the challenges are in relation to that, and priorities and strategies to help catch up and counter inequalities. Louisa, would you like to come in? Do you have a question related to those objectives, either of those objectives? Is she here? Doesn't look like she is. Okay, Councillor Shorhan?
They're not directly related to that, so...
Okay, It's okay. You can ask your question.
Well, it's related to the head teachers. I think the government has issued roughly 300 guidelines to school by the 2nd of July. Do you anticipate many more guidelines, and could this change the model you've set your sights on at the moment for September?
I can come in on that if you want.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris.
I think it's a very short answer. I think probably yes, we do anticipate some changes, and yes, it will definitely have an impact on the plans I have for September. I think if there are any changes in terms of, say, for example, increasing the importance of social distancing, I'll have to significantly rethink what I'm doing. If there's any loosening, I think this is very unlikely, I have to say, if there's any loosening of the guidelines, then I also might consider rethinking what I'm doing, because as with Richard and I think all Hackney schools, maybe with one exception, operate a very, very small site. And so logistically, it is very complex. I can see both Jane and Richard nodding away. It is logistically very complex to manage what we have to do in September. And I mean, huge credit to my deputies who have put it together. But yes, absolutely. Even the smallest change in government guidelines is likely to have quite a big knock-on impact on the logistics for schools in September.
It has been a very complex process preparing for September. When you take into account what has been asked of us, so not just social distancing, but separate access, lunchtime, break time, dismissals, bubbles, year groups, what curriculum can and can't run. And I think that although we have a plan drawn up, I think we're very sensitive to the fact that it's probably unlikely that particular version of the plan will go into place. I think that there is, and I do speak on behalf of other head teachers, perhaps I shouldn't do so, but there is a little resentment that we so often get information announced to us, and it does feel that it's not working with us, and that we're then trying to respond to that in a way that perhaps is not very inclusive and or respectful of the profession. And I think that's been certainly a challenge for ourselves when we're trying to create plans. And sometimes we would like an acknowledgement that these are challenging times. The best way to resolve those issues is to work together and to communicate with us in a timely manner. So we are just about to go into the school holidays, and we've got our plans, and it would be unfortunate if those were announced then just as we were about to return to school, as opposed to trying to communicate with us in a more strategic manner.
Thank you for that, Jane. I think I'm just going to ask one question in relation to extending in-school provision, and just a broad story about what the challenges are, and I suppose the different strategies that schools will be deploying to try and engage parents and allay any fears that they may have about their children returning to school, and indeed re-engaging children who may well have fallen off the radar a bit in recent months. I don't know if any of the head teachers would like to come in on that.
Well, I'm happy to, Councillor Conway. I think the worst option is actually threatening parents with fines, and that will certainly be something that will be a last resort for me. I think the anxieties that people have are genuine. I think it's about communicating with parents to try to allay those anxieties. The complexities around extending provision are physical. They're about how many kids you're having in the building at any time. And if you extend the provision for one group, you're actually in some ways potentially extending risk because you're having more kids on site. That is why I want to use Saturday mornings certainly productively from that point of view. I've also been in contact with quite a lot of Urswick alumni, particularly ex-sixth formers that have now finished uni. A number of those are potentially available to do tutoring and would be very good at it, and also are representative of the school population, and so I think have a genuine relevance to kids, because there's nothing more chronic than coming in on a Saturday morning to meet some miserable looking person who you cannot really connect with. And so I would very much like to use some of my lovely ex-students in this role. And I think hopefully that will be a creative solution which could work in quite a number of different schools, actually.
I think, Councillor Conway, if I can come in as well about getting children back into school. I think the head teachers have talked very much about the importance of the relationships, and I really think that's the case. Obviously, sometimes the relationships aren't there with students coming in new to year 7 and year 12, so those are particularly important groups to work with. We'll be doing some things across the council in terms of making sure that parents from all backgrounds know that everybody is expected back unless there are particular circumstances around health. And I think the other thing is that we don't work alone. So for those children who are known to Young Hackney and to the Children and Family Service, those workers in those teams will also be very much working with the families to make sure they're ready to come back to school. So I think there will be a good joint effort across all partners through August and into the early September and beyond.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Annie. And lastly, I think we're going to move very, very briefly on to Objective 3, which is about priorities and strategies to help catch up and counter inequalities. What do we think that looks like? What do you have planned for September? I know that many of you are saying the same thing about you just don't know the scale of this issue until the children, return to school and you get to gauge the extent of the deficit. But I'm wondering what are the plans at the moment? Chris.
Yeah, I'll happily speak to that. I was just doing some work on it with subject leaders today, actually. I mean, I think what Stephen said earlier was very accurate. So I think, if we just don't think about exam classes for a moment, with the other classes, it's key, I think, to understand that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so what we need to do is very accurately assess what's been missed, but also, and this is what my subject leaders are currently doing, and this is exactly what Stephen was talking about, think very hard about which bits of knowledge in the curriculum are essential to access the rest of the curriculum. Because some of the curriculum is less essential from that perspective. You could argue it's essential from other perspectives, but for right now, what we need to do is allow students to access the curriculum going forward. And by doing that, we therefore buy ourselves the maximum amount of time to address any gaps that we do find through our assessments. So the big bit of work we're doing at the moment is subject leaders identifying precisely those essential bits of knowledge. And then, exactly as Stephen said, looking at where in the curriculum it would be best to address them, so that when we do our formative assessments, if we find that those are the gaps that students have, we know where the best place to reteach them most effectively is going to be. Of course, it is slightly different for years 11 and 13, where in effect it is somewhat of a sprint, if not definitely a bit of a sprint for year 11. And so for them, and I'm sure this is probably true, and Jane already referenced it, we've done exams already for them off-site, and we'll do another set of assessments when they come in, just to get a really accurate picture of what they don't know. And of course, we also need to wait for the outcomes of the off-qual consultations, so that we know precisely what the exams are going to look like in the summer, and then put in place what needs to happen to address. As much as it pains me to say it, for some of our students, that may mean that we have to have a smaller range, and I really do mean for a very small number, a smaller range of options for them at GCSE to make sure that they get the subjects that are most essential for them to then be able to go on to the next stage of their education. And then that's where we might utilise one-to-one tutoring and so on in certain areas. But yeah, I hope that gives a bit of an overview of what we're doing.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's quite distressing to hear that that you may well be forced to make those sorts of decisions, and reducing the number of GCSEs that some students. I suppose it just wasn't even something that I'd even considered, but I suppose it makes sense if you just don't have the time and resources to make up for the deficit. Councillor Etty, we have one question from Councillor Etty, and then I think we're going to sum up and move on to the next item. Councillor Etty.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm not taking any your time. I wanted the question is to all. Both Hackney Learning Trust and all head teachers. I'm looking at what has happened in terms of George Floyd and BAME children and the impact. So I just wanted to know how we will work collectively, individually, in terms of togetherness and also with council when it comes to reassurance of our children, because that reassurance is very key, and in terms of fair treatment. So I'm just thinking, what are the plans that has been put in place when it comes to this collective? I mean, in terms, what are the plans that has been put in place, or has this been given any consideration at all, or we're just thinking, is this something we'll deal with when we come in September? Thank you.
I think if I can answer that to start with, and then the head teachers might want to come in. Councillor Etty, it's been affected everybody. It's been hugely on our minds, and we've been very aware of the impact on children and their families across Hackney. Quite soon after the killing of George Floyd, the extended opening was happening for schools, so children were coming back into schools, and we did share assemblies that could be used, drawing on colleagues, teaching colleagues' contributions. In terms of us, we've also discussed it at all the head teacher meetings we've had and governor meetings, and we've had a specific meeting for Hackney Learning Trust staff and anyone involved in education to listen to how people were feeling and to think about how we could take things forward together. We have a follow-up meeting tomorrow. Councillor Bramwell was involved in the first meeting very helpfully and is again involved tomorrow. So we are in the early stages of building a strategy a bit wider that builds on the young black men's work. But I probably want to wait for the meeting tomorrow before I say too much more, but thinking about the curriculum, about staff, about families. I should say the Hackney Schools Group Board has been involved in helping 6 schools pilot sessions with families, with parents, so that they can hear how parents feel about the issues. And those sessions with parents happen today and are happening tomorrow. So I think there is a great sadness, but also a real will to make a change at this point. I don't know if any of the head teachers wanted to give.
Do any of the heads want to come in?
I'm happy to come in one respect. I think we have a huge staff resource in Hackney, because certainly my school, and I know most other schools, are actually more diverse in terms of the heritage of their staff, and that includes the leadership teams of many schools as well. So I think actually one of the advantages has been of the recent time that we've not had a full school is that has given staff more opportunity to think, and as they've been planning for the restart curriculum in September, part of that has been within the context of what's happened and the traumas that might have developed as a result of that, and the feeling of giving youngsters an opportunity to articulate a sense of injustice. It is quite difficult, though, to connect with kids on issues like this unless you are doing it face to face. We've had most face-to-face engagement with regarding our sixth form, but undoubtedly there is work to do with other year groups in September to engage on those specific issues.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'm just to summarise, I'm wondering if it would be, I think it would be quite useful for us to hear from each of the schools in turn about what they feel we could do, I suppose Hackney Learning Trust could do, if there's anything more that Hackney Learning Trust might be able to do, or more of the same, to support schools in terms of continuing, I suppose, to deliver education to children under these circumstances, and also to prepare for the transition back into school in September and bridging that attainment gap. Can I start with you, Chris? If there's anything, I mean, if you're completely happy with it, how everything's been going, then by all means, please do so.
I mean, I think an awful lot of good work has been done, definitely, and I'm very happy to say that. For me, I think the key thing is going to be around just forums for sharing best practice and all of us working together. And when I say all of us, I really mean all schools, but also really having very much a multi-agency approach. Where we were most successful in the lockdown with students that we were struggling to get hold of was where we were able to work together with other agencies to make sure that we were able to be in contact with them. So, I mean, I really just think like really clear channels of communication and opportunities to find out about things that other schools are doing that are working really successfully would be enormously helpful. I mean, unless you can double our budgets, of course, in which case, please feel free to do that.
Richard?
Some of you know me well, so you know I'm ready to set a challenge every now and again. Can we get Hackney's public libraries open, and can we give some priority for young people being able to use those libraries at specific times? My school library has actually been open for several weeks now, and children of all year groups have been able to come in and borrow books, and that's been a powerful way of reconnecting with some of the year groups. But equally, libraries are a real powerful way of remedying housing inequality. And if kids have got nowhere to do homework and nowhere to study at the weekend, let's use Hackney's public libraries, obviously in a way which is safe and consistent with all of the issues that we all know about opening with COVID. But there must be a way of getting those libraries open.
Thank you, Richard. Jane?
Anne Canning asked a question earlier about transition to year 11 and post 16. I think that's an area still to explore. I think going back to some of the questions about making sure that what's happening with our NEETs or possible NEETs, and those children who decide not to go to university after this year for lots of different and good reasons. How can we help those? And the government, as you may be aware, is providing funding for that. So how can we get together to exploit that? And I understand you may not want to bring your own children back into your own school because they do need an experience outside that. But if we could work in partnership across the borough, where we work together to give placement opportunities for our young people, I think that would be quite an exciting opportunity and something that really worthwhile as we face what will.
Oops, you're on mute.
So as we face a recession, that those young people may not have job opportunities outside. I think that would be really, for me, something I would want to encourage in that field. And to echo also what Richard said about the libraries, please open.
Thank you very much. And Justine, if you wanted to come in, you're not on my grid, so I'm not sure if you're still there.
I'm still here.
Great.
To be honest, everyone's covered these items really well. I do think there's an issue which was brought up a little bit earlier about parents and parent engagement, and that's one of the things that I think we've seen lots of issues with in terms of their ability to support the learners, but also, as somebody else mentioned, around what is going on at home and additional needs and things like that in terms of safeguarding or mental health, etc. And what's slightly problematic, of course, is the difficulty of getting parents into school in the new autumn term to have that face-to-face contact, because it's the ones that are struggling with technology. So looking at support structures, I think, wider support structures where we can get groups of parents together, not necessarily from a given school, but across the borough, to provide the support, the signposting for additional support and engagement on online learning and catch-up resources and things like that would probably help all schools in the borough.
Thank you very much, Justine. And I'm wondering if Rebecca would like to come in with any suggestions for how we might, obviously we've seen your recommendations from the reports, but I just wondered if there was anything that you would like to add in light of what you've already heard from our schools this evening.
Rebecca had to leave.
Oh, sorry.
She left a message in the paper.
Okay, in which case I think it's been really useful for us to hear from schools and about the daily challenges that you've been facing and the anticipated challenges that you expect when you return in September, if the government doesn't release new guidelines that suggest that things are going to be different to what you may well have anticipated. But thank you so much for coming, for joining this meeting. do not need to stay for the next item, but you can if you want to. But thank you so much for your contributions. We understand how busy you are, so we really are grateful for your time this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye, Richard. I just want to briefly go back actually to the previous item, because I forgot to ask members in relation to the briefings whether there was anything that came out of the briefings that you felt we may benefit from focusing on at any future meetings. Sorry to put this on you and an hour after we've discussed it, you may not even remember what was discussed, but I just had my notes that I wanted to give you the opportunity, because obviously this evening, this focus on the divide, the attainment gap, is obviously linked to what emerged from the briefings and the young people's contributions at the previous meeting. So I don't know if anybody had any. Yeah, James, Councillor Peters. Sorry.
So I think it would be helpful for us to come back to something that is sort of spans those two items, which is the additional resourcing that is going to go into schools to try to catch up or help pupils catch up with any shortfall in the teaching from this year, because that's something that very much came out of certainly the LSE paper. That this is bad, but it can be rectified. But that rectification isn't going to be quick, and it's certainly not going to be easy.
So you suggest that how would you suggest that we do that in a few months' time? That we ask schools to come back, perhaps, or to hear from the Hackney Learning Trust, or even to get some feedback potentially from one of the teacher forums about how they have broached or dealt with the managed the additional money, the additional funding in light of actual needs.
So I think that's right, but I think that this is potentially a longer term piece of work as well that we can revisit on a number of occasions over the next couple of years, maybe.
I think this perhaps touches on something that Councillor Gordon actually mentioned in the pre-meet, actually, about wanting to have a better sense of the broader landscape. And did you want to come in on that, Councillor Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably does touch on that a bit, really. I mean, I think how our sort of strategies in terms of education, and this really sort of links into, I think, what Jane was saying about employment opportunities for young people. I mean, so the different bits of our sort of landscape.
I think we're losing you a bit.
How the inclusive concept. Sorry, yeah. Yes, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think it would be good to look at the long-term financial impact. Sorry, yeah.
I think you're back now.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I think it would be good to look at the.
Just typical, isn't it? The internet just always seems to do that. Just when we think we've got you again,
long-term financial impact, economic things. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I think I've finished. I don't want to take any more time.
If you can put it in the chat, it might be useful for people to see. But okay, it just feels as though it's an ongoing piece of work, I think, and maybe something for us to discuss when we're talking about the work programme going forward. But I think for now we'll just keep having those briefings. And we can determine. Although, actually, one thing I did want to ask was about obviously the digital divide keeps coming up again and again, and I just wondered if we can have sight of the digital divide strategy that you mentioned, Annie. I think that would be quite useful for us to look at least, even if we just note it at the next meeting, if possible. Okay, now. We're really over time, so I'm going to try and get through the next few items quickly. So the next item is item 6, which is childcare sufficiency. I'd like to ask members to turn to page 35 of the agenda pack. The Childcare Sufficiency Assessment is a standing item within the work programme to ensure the Commission has oversight of the capacity, quality and uptake of local childcare services. The Childcare Sufficiency Assessment has not been possible this year due to the impact of COVID, and the paper at page 36 of the report pack provides a snapshot of current position. We have 30 minutes for this item, although I'm probably going to have to reduce that quite significantly in light of the fact that we're over. So I'd like to start by inviting Donna Thomas, the Head of Early Years, to present the key issues from the paper. Donna, if I can ask if you could do that in about 5 minutes, if possible. I know there's quite a lot for you to get through, but if you could be as brief as possible, and then we'll open up to the Commission for questions. Donna.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay.
If I can present that, and if there are any questions, then Tim, my colleague, is also on the line and he's done the audit. So as you know, we are required to do a childcare audit every 2 years, and that audit is really about ensuring that there are sufficient childcare places for all children whose parents are going to work, but also for those children that are eligible for their 2, 3 and 4 year free early years funding entitlements. So that's the reason behind the sufficiency audit. We did that in preparation. So this year, 2020, we were due to do that, and we did that early in March, which would have given us more time to work through the paper or the findings until June. The snapshot that we got in March told us actually that there were sufficient childcare places to meet demand, and we know that there were sufficient childcare places because what that meant were there were vacancies across Hackney in different settings. Tim can give us a bit more information about that. However, clearly what's happened since then is COVID. And with settings being asked to close their businesses, their nurseries to children and families, except for children of critical workers and also for vulnerable children, it affected a number of our settings. We have 364 settings, including 176 childminders. So if you are a setting, largely a playgroup, most of your children will be funded through their free entitlement. That means you have a very small percentage of your income that comes from fees. However, if you are a private nursery, you'll have a minority of children with their free entitlement, and most of your funding will come from fees. So what that meant is that actually for the time that those nurseries were closed, they did not receive a fee income. What that has meant for us is they are almost at seas, and we're wanting to see in the autumn term whether their business will bounce back. So just to give a flavour, we know that a number of our settings, mostly our private voluntary independent settings, less so our playgroups, furloughed a number of their staff. So they closed and they furloughed their staff. They were relying on the government's job retention scheme in order to receive an element of income. They continue to receive the income for their 2, 3 and 4 year olds that are funded through the free entitlement, irrespective of whether those children were there. So that again gave some comfort within their business. But when we look at where we are right now, 1st of June, as you know, the government said that settings could open wider. In opening wider, they needed to maintain small groups of children. The small groups of children were about 8 children. And in maintaining 8 groups referred to as bubbles, they had to make sure that those bubbles did not cross other bubbles. So it was about infection control. That meant that where a setting could have ordinarily have 60 children, it reduced their capacity by at least 50%. In some cases, 60%, 40%, depending on how big a setting they are. So it meant that they couldn't take in all of those children in any case because they didn't have the capacity to do so. That affected their income considerably. And some settings, a minority at this moment in time, still haven't opened. With a view to open in September. The reasons why they haven't opened so far is they either don't have sufficient children to make it worth their while to open, or parents are not wanting to come back at this moment in time. So the market at the moment is quite fragile. It's a little bit unstable. And whilst we could say in March we had sufficient places, we don't know whether we are going to have sufficient places in September. It really does depend on whether or not all of our settings open for business and they stay they maintain their viability. During this period, some have accessed, well, we don't know, they've applied for the council's discretionary grant, they've made use of the job retention scheme, as I've said. They've also, some will receive a rates payment holiday during this period. So they've done a number of things to look at their business, look at the viability and make a decision at the moment about whether they open or not, based on whether or not it's in their business interest to do so. The early years team have been supporting them through this period. It's Tim and his team have maintained daily briefings with our settings and weekly contact with them in addition to the daily briefings. So that just gives you a snapshot at this moment in time, and I'm very happy to give you any more information if that would be helpful, or to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Donna. Members, do you have any questions? And thank you, Donna, for the really thorough report. It really did highlight the extent of the issues that we're facing in early years. Do we have any questions from members? If not, then I'd like to. Okay, Councillor Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much, Donna, for your report and and all the work that you've done in this area. I mean, obviously, it's a very, very worrying situation about the potential fragility of our childcare provision. So, I mean, I understand that, for example, the New Economics Foundation has called on the government to provide funding for childcare provision to tide them over this next period, as they are, an essential underpinning not only of early years education but also of the economy. It'd be very interesting to hear from you and maybe Councillor Woodley about any sort of work that's been done in relation to financial support for this sector. And also, if I can be cheeky enough to ask a sort of second question. I mean, obviously, providing childcare for working parents, for key workers and other parents is going to be a really sort of essential part of a safe return to work for all of us. So I wondered how much work you've been doing across the council really in terms of the inclusive economy strategy and about how this sort of childcare sector can sort of underpin the sort of bigger picture in terms of support for our working families as well as for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Donna, can I hand back to you?
Yes, certainly. And Tim, if you need anything to say, then please do also. So in terms of, I think the question is not just about our providers, it's also about our parents. So what we do in attendance, it was daily, it's now cut down to fortnightly reporting. And what that's told us is that there are parents who previously required a full-time place since the 1st of June have been asking for a part-time place. And some parents who've been offered a place since June are choosing to defer until September. And we know anecdotally from what some parents have told us is, either they or their partner have been furloughed, or they or their partner are not working at the moment, or they run a business which has been affected by the current circumstance. So when you look at the fragility, it's not just in terms of the settings, but also in terms of the parents who are our customers and the end users. So in terms of work, I think we have a full strategy, very much as the schools have described during this period. So home learning resources, food packs, resources packs, even down to some nappies that parents may have wanted and not been able to get hold of. We've provided support in a number of ways. We even did a survey, I think it was April, did we do a survey? April, May? We did a survey just to find out how COVID-19 has affected our parents. And so they gave us some feedback, which is where I'm able to share some of the information with you. And some, you know, it affects everybody in a very different, a very individual, a very unique way. And so for some, it was a period to spend time with their children. For others, it's thank you for the food parcels, however we need actual cash. And for others, it was really around not having the computers, the laptops. I think before the government made the announcements, on the ground, we were evidencing where some of the gaps were, not having access to technology. So it meant that we had to really think about what support we were going to give them. And some of that support meant that actually, rather than, you know, asking them to log on, we had to make packs up and hand deliver it to their homes. For others, we've had to support them with accessing finances and benefits during this period, getting them financial advice and financial support. I think where we are now is thinking about the recovery. How do we bounce back? How do we bounce back for our settings? But also, how do we support parents to bounce back? So online training is the next phase, really, and starting to think about what support, what skills do they need during this period to prepare them for the next phase of recovery. So that's some of the work that's been taking place. And we don't do that in isolation. So Annie talked about the vulnerable pupils group that was set up and the work that we've done with FAST. That also included early years. In fact, Tim also was part of that programme in terms of supporting our most vulnerable children and families, not just from an early years perspective, but working across the 0 to 19 system with our colleagues in Young Hackney and Children's Social Care in particular, but also with health, because we can't work successfully with children and families in the early years without working with our health partners, who've also been critical to this. I'm hoping that answers your question, but if it doesn't, please let me know.
Thank you very much, Donna. So I have a question from Councillor Etty, and then I will probably sum up with a couple of questions that I have. I think there's also a question from Shabnam. So we'll probably just have 4 more questions before we end this item. Councillor Etty.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Donna, for all you're doing. In response to what you have just said, when we're talking about parental support and ensuring that the settings are safe, you know, come September, you've talked about online training. What about parents how about those parents who do not have the capacity, or in terms of who do not have the knowledge, or in terms of education when it comes to online training? What measures are being put in place to engage those parents?
Okay,
I think the most important thing is the confidence, parental confidence that these settings are okay, it's safe for your children to go back in. I mean, with the scenario you have given, it's just one side of a scenario, those that have lost their job. There are people who have not lost their job, who actually have their jobs, but where the fear is just there as in, look, this is not safe for my children to go back. So what other measures are we putting in place for those parents?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So during the lockdown period, we had probably about 600 children attending during that period. From the 1st of June, we have had children incrementally attending, and what that means is in a period of probably 5 weeks, we've moved from having an attendance of 600 to over 4,000 children now in attendance. So I think the work that we've done, and certainly with Tim's team, of those daily briefings, of the weekly contacts with the settings, of helping them with their risk assessments, helping them with their communication with parents, and also our own website, thinking about what information we make available on the website. So there's some of the strategies that we've deployed in collaboration with our settings to raise that confidence level, so long as, you know, we working with them to make sure that we're offering something that we can make as safe as we possibly can, but obviously we cannot offer any assurances or any guarantees. So it is work in progress. That said, the other side of that is the other part of the work that we do is the early help. And so our referrals for early help, I thought that they'd reduced. They hadn't reduced. We'd almost maintained the same level of referrals into our early help service, which, for want of another word, is our family support service. So we have 59 referrals come in between the end of March and the end of June. On average, we would get anywhere between 50 and 60 referrals anyway. So that shows those referrals have continued to come in. Our teams have worked, they really have worked overboard, whether keeping in contact with our most vulnerable families, whether that be via Zoom, WhatsApp, Google Hangouts, whatever method of communication those parents have needed. And when they haven't had those methods of communication, we've continued. Our doors have been open. So not only have our critical workers and our vulnerable children come in, and some of those children are children that have been in receipt of early help, we've also provided respite places during this period as well. And we've provided food parcels for those that haven't come in, but actually what we've also done is encourage families to come in. So those that are less anxious, we've asked them to come in and get their food packs or food vouchers, and they've done that also. So we have got those parents who largely are our working parents who may have access to technology and have used it. But for the other families, we've even opened our toy libraries and our book libraries just to support them where they are. So they have been, I would say that those families that have been in our family support teams have been emotionally held and contained. They've had their food phone calls. Some will have phone calls twice a week. Others, it may be 3 times a week, depending on what their circumstances are. And, you know, when we think about, I can think of one family where the childminder actually lived above a family member, and the parent wouldn't take the child into nursery because she was so anxious. Well, actually, it was the childminder that provided that level of containment. It wasn't a professional, you know, in the local authority. It was actually the childminder that encouraged that parent very slowly until she had the confidence to come further and further out of her home. So as a system, I'd like to think that we've probably worked better together the last 3 months than we've ever worked together, and working with our vulnerable parents, working with our anxious parents. And to be honest, everyone's been anxious during this period. Everyone's displayed a level of anxiety. Why wouldn't we? And then those families who really needed to be back at work and therefore use provision. But I'm hoping the evidence is we've moved from 600 children across all of our settings accessing during that period to over 4,000 children now in attendance.
Thank you very much, Donna. I think Councillor Woodley, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just because Councillor Gordon did suggest I might, and I did think there might be a few things worth saying. I mean, first of all, big thank you to the early years team and Donna, because they really did maintain a close oversight of our settings and our overall childcare market. You know, this is a national concern and has been much in the press. It was alleviated, I suppose, somewhat for our settings when the part furloughing came in. The job retention scheme kind of became a little bit more nuanced to allow part furloughing so that settings could open for small numbers of children. We still had a few sort of private nurseries that we were concerned about, but we, the early years team ensured they were eligible for the discretionary grant, the sort of the business grant, for the first time that nurseries could apply to those, and I hope some of those did and did benefit from it. In terms of next steps, you know, we have the early help review underway, and we'll be working this autumn on an early years strategy. I'm not sure what can come into the scope of that, but I imagine we'll be looking to review rates, fees and charges, and perhaps even the targets set by the funding formula for take up, in terms of if parents aren't going to be sending all their children back, you know, what can we reasonably expect settings to reach in terms of their take up targets. And then beyond that, we're also looking at the holistic work of children's centres and how they can support families over and above the work they already do, and whether we can extend that and in the right directions. And again, there's already been amazing work done there in terms of supporting families with trauma and bereavement and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add emphasis that there's a lot of thinking going on, and obviously a lot more work to be done, but everybody's very kind of focused on that and ready to go.
Can I just add, just a point to Councillor Gordon's about the government making additional funding available. So there was a briefing with the TFE last week, and where they've made funding available to schools, they're not making the same funding available to early years. What they did say, however, is that we needed to look out for another briefing around early years finances, where they may make some exceptional funding available. But yeah, we're yet to see the detail on that.
Thank you very much, Donna. Yep, I can see heads shaking. Yep, more uncertainty, which is just what we need at the moment. Moving on to Shabnam, did you want to ask your question? Okay, I'm going to read the question out because I can't see you here. What work is being done to improve the awareness, understanding of the Inclusion Fund in support of children requiring SEND support?
Okay, Tim, assuming you're on the line, I'm going to hand this one over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Inclusion Fund is a fund which allows 3 and 4-year-olds to access their early years provision who may have emerging special educational needs. So they are not children with EHC plans, they're children who have got emerging concerns, where if we provide some funding, can more easily access their provision the fund is available for all providers, childminders, nurseries, playgroups, and nursery classes in schools. It's been extensively promoted in all schools and all settings. Sencos working in schools are aware of the grant which they can apply for. The area Sencos that are employed by Hackney Learning Trust that are linked to every single private and voluntary and independent school are aware of the fund and how to apply for it. And support applications. Applications to the fund have gone up. It's in the Childcare Sufficiency report. So yeah, applications to it are going up, and that's got to be a good thing because it's increasing access for those children.
Thank you very much, Tim. I now have just 2 questions. We're obviously, it's quite concerning to hear the loss of income to our children's centres and nursery provision. And I just wondered if it's likely that this is likely to have an impact on the viability of our children's centres and if there's anything that we're doing to mitigate the financial impact. Can I just also ask the second question, which is about business support to any private nurseries that may need it?
Okay, yeah, so the business support is quite thorough, and Tim can answer that one in a minute. Yeah, they've had business support throughout this period. Tim can give us a bit more detail. Children's centres, we've costed the Children's Centre loss of income from the end of March until the end of June. As 1 million, just over £1 million, 1.1 million. So we have identified that, we've costed that, and we're putting a bit more rigour around that funding or that amount, just to make sure that it is absolutely COVID related and not as not in response to other practice per se, but it's being costed at 1.1 million in fact at the moment. And that has been shared with senior officers, it's been shared with our lead members, it's been shared with our group director. And I think there is a commitment to, especially for the school-based children's centres, because for the maintained children's centres, we're part of the council, so it will be managed in the same way as the other loss of income for council services. But for the school-based children's centres, they're obviously managed by governors as part of the school. So there is a paper looking at what that debt recovery plan might look like. And, you know, we are aware that the government has made it, you know, you're more aware than I am, has made funding available to local authorities in response to loss of income from COVID-19. But we know that that's not enough to pick up all of the gaps. But there is a commitment from senior officers to look at what that recovery plan might look like. in order to give the schools especially some confidence that they can continue to deliver children's centre services without having such a big debt as part of their school's finance.
Thank you very much. Tim, did you want to come in on the business support?
Yeah.
I suppose the thing that I'm getting at is are we doing anything in addition to what we would normally do to obviously address the emerging issues that our private nurseries will be experiencing at this time?
Yeah, can I start by just referencing what Rebecca was talking about when she mentioned the Sutton Trust report into early years. It came out last month, and it was written by Chris Pascal and Tony Bertram, and they're very eminent academics. The report suggested that in deprived local authorities, their report suggested that up to 35% of settings were at risk of closing within the year. The report said that 69% of nurseries were running a financial deficit. They were running at an operating loss. The picture that the Sutton Trust report painted about the prospects of early years was really, really bleak. I don't think the situation is quite as bleak in Hackney, but that's because, and Donna's already mentioned this, it's because of, in part, the business support which has been provided to date. We've supported settings with how to furlough staff and how to bring staff back off furlough and to take advantage of that scheme. We've supported them with the discretionary grants. We've supported them to apply for childminders to apply for the self-employed that was available, and the business rates, obviously they benefited enormously from that. We've supported settings with renegotiating or negotiating rent holidays. It's not been entirely successful, so some settings have managed to get a reduction in rent, some haven't, and those ones that have not got a reduction in rent, they're facing all the overheads, but they're not getting any income in order to pay for all those overheads. Having said that, my biggest anxiety is next term. This term, all the 2-, 3-, and 4-year-old funding was paid on the basis of children who would have attended. We don't think that's going to be the case next term, that the public income that settings receive will be only the children that are actually attending, not the children that would have attended were it not for COVID. So that's likely to have a big impact. Settings haven't been able to recruit the numbers of children that they would normally recruit for September because some of them have been closed, they haven't been able to do tours. So I think the challenge for settings will be to recruit 2-year-olds and 3- and 4-year-olds to come in September, or if not in September, to come in October so that they can be funded for the whole term. And I think that's the challenge that business support faces at the moment. How do we encourage parents who are rightly anxious and they're very nervous about the situation? They don't want to send their children back to nursery, because if you're a 2-year-old, you're eligible for 2-year-old funding because you're not working. So why should you send your children back to nursery? And I think that's the challenge for us going forward, is how do we support nurseries to market those places? How do we get them to contact the families in their area and encourage them to come back? And that I think is an extensive piece of work. It's not limited to business support. I think it works across the whole of early years and children's centres. I think there needs to be, in the autumn term, it's right, now's the time to get your child back into nursery or to take up a nursery place. That, to my mind, is what the focus will be for the autumn term.
So I think, just to add to that, I mean, I think that's outside of the business support role. So I think that's the role that we are doing in FIS in the children's centres now, looking at those eligible 2-year-olds. We know that you're not ready to take up a place, but actually we're going to start making contact with you. We're going to give you a virtual tour of the local children's centre. We're going to ask you whether or not you want to you know, have some resources that you can come in for to collect, or we can bring round to you. So I think part of that building confidence in the market and confidence to transition into nursery in September is about what we do now over the summer. And that's why the summer programme is quite critical during this period for making those contacts and carrying on business as usual as far as we can to make contact with those families now and not later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but it just feels much like with the previous item that this is that we're still very much dealing with unknowns, and it feels as though we are probably not in a great position to decide what we want to do in terms of, you know, if we want you to come back or to hear more about anything until we have a full sense of what we're actually dealing with here. So it seems to me as though it would be a good idea if we could perhaps have another sort of update from you, perhaps I don't know, around October, November time, when we've properly gauged what it looks like in our, what the situation looks like in our settings, and then we can determine sort of going forward if we want to do a broader piece of work looking at how we address any issues there may be in terms of take up or sufficiency or anything related. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I think probably later. I think we'd probably need a full term, which takes us into at least the end of October before we had a really good picture of what was going on. But certainly,
Okay.
yes.
So if we maybe suggest November,
That would give us a better flavour, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring this item to a close now. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you. So just to let members know, I've obviously not been chairing this particularly well because we've overran by 30 minutes, which is outrageous. So I'm going to propose that item 7 and indeed item 8 that we take up, Martin and I will send you an email detailing the updates in relation to our review looking at school exclusions, and also details of the work programme, and that we can engage with members via email about any contributions that they have in relation to either of those things, if that's okay. Is that okay with members? Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So in which case, moving on to item 9, the minutes. The minutes of the previous meetings of the Commission are contained within the agenda report pack. You've got minutes of January, February, March, May and June. There are a number of further information requests from the Commission from the 15th of June meeting, which have been distributed to the Commission or contained within briefings elsewhere in the agenda. I'd like to ask members to note and agree the minutes. Great.
Agreed.
Thank you very much.
Agreed.
As there is no other business, I would like to remind the Commission that the date of the next meeting is Tuesday, the 8th of September 2020. Thank you, everybody, for attending this evening and for your contributions and for your patience with me and my timekeeping.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.